Hello, my name is Jason Buffetti, Senior Program Officer at the NEH and Team Leader for the Scholarly Editions and Scholarly Translations Grant Program. This pre-recorded webinar will provide an overview of this grant program and provide some additional information about the application instructions. I will largely focus on programmatic topics, so if you have questions about preparing your budget, this might not be the webinar for you. While it's not intended as a complete guide to writing an application, I hope you will find it helpful. The statements that I make in this webinar are superseded by the notice of funding opportunity, so please be prepared. Please prepare your application using that document. NEH is a federal agency funded by you, the taxpayer. Our overall funding ratio is about 17%, about 23% for this program. Keep in mind that for new projects, the funding rate is closer to that 75%. We do a fair amount of funding in this program for returning projects, mostly in American history and literature, but the majority of applications are for new projects. So again, that's about 17% for this particular program for new projects. You'll want to find, go to the landing page and find some of this important information there in this box that I've highlighted under Grant Snapshot. This will give you the key dates that you'll want to look at. The October start date for projects coincides with the beginning of the fiscal year rather than the academic calendar. So the various deadlines for this grant cycle has a lot to do with our division schedule, the timing of national council meetings, and many other programs that our division staff handles during this time of year. So going over to our the deadlines, the application deadline for this program is December 1st, 2021 at midnight. Keep in mind it's midnight. It's probably not a good idea to wait until the very last second because there can be snafus that happened, and also there can be a delay in when you submit. So I would recommend not waiting up until that last minute. There'll be a crush of applications for our program and lots of others on grants.gov. Also, other dates here of notification date. We typically do notify a little before that August 31st deadline for ourselves, but it's closer to the beginning of August. But that's sort of our drop dead deadline for notification. The earliest start date for projects would be October of next year, October 1st, and the latest start date would be September 1st of 2023. If you need to delay your start of your program, of your grant. One important change has been the draft submission deadline has been moved up to September 24th, which is about a month away. Part of the reason for that is the early deadline is that there's time for us to read over all the drafts and get them back to you with plenty of time to make corrections and continue to work on your drafts. So drafts are not required, but it can be helpful, and I will endeavor to read those. And of course, we take them and respond to them in order that we receive them. So the sooner you get them to us, the sooner we'll be able to start reviewing them, and sooner they'll get back to you. Waiting until the last minute to submit that on September 24th can obviously lead to it taking longer for us to get back to you. So what is a scholarly edition project for us? It includes most work editing, annotating, and translating. It does not include printing or the marketing of a project. It can be many combinations of print and digital, or even both. We fund the texts that that scholars cannot have easy access to, either because they're in archives or scattered about, or are texts that do not have adequate translations or adequate editions. Perhaps an older edition that doesn't done up to the latest standards of what editorial people expect, editorial contact people expect. They can, in fact, be in a foreign language, so our editions don't have to be a translation into English, but it needs to be in the original language, not translations into a third language, so to speak. it needs to be, these editions need to have humanities content, that these need to be ultimately for humanities audience. It's important that they be centered, that they be humanities centered, and have a use for those types of scholars. And that there be added scholarly content. It's not enough to simply do a transcription or a translation unless there is additional either headnotes or footnotes or citations that explain the way words are translated or the particular use of a word in that context. So some kind of scholarly additional content beyond transcription is important to this program. And that these be true collaborations between scholars. I think it's important that we make a case that there is more than sort of one scholar involved in the project. So not simply one scholar and then sort of one graduate assistant. We wanted to see a graduate. We wanted to see someone who is a peer in a collaborative role. These are institutional grants, not individual grants. So these will be housed at an institution. And we have begun making a special plea for planning stage projects. I don't think we've seen quite enough of these, and I think we could see more, and we want to encourage more. So I've scattered some prompts within the guidelines for planning stage projects that would typically be 1 to 2 years at the start of a project, and usually at a lower dollar amount. It's like $75,000 per year for something at that phase. What makes a competitive project? First, you have to make the case for significance. You cannot assume that a text needs to have an addition or translation. Make the case in your application clearly for anyone reading it who might be outside of the field. Make a case for the particular language that you're going to be either translating into, or the need not to or the desire not to translate it, but to leave it in the original. Why is that? And then make, of course, a case for scholarly content. What is being added, and why is that important for this particular text? What are going to be the things that you're going to either write headnotes about, or what kind of things you're going to write footnotes about and explain in that scholarly content, and show changes from between various versions of the text. Discuss that content in detail. And then, as I mentioned before, that there be kind of an appropriate level of collaboration among scholars, the right people with the right set of skills. That you have a well thought out plan, a kind of realistic overall time frame for what you can accomplish, not overly ambitious. Also, there should be some thought given to, if it's a project that will take more than one award or more than one application, what are the long-term goals for the edition? What are the short-term goals for your particular application, and whatever phase you're in, making it clear what's going to get accomplished during that particular time frame of the 1, 2, or 3 years you'll be asking for support. And that you have a clear product. I think it can often be the case that a project hasn't necessarily thought out what type of, whether it's going to be digital or print, and then why that choice was made, or if there's going to be a combination of the two. I think it's important here too to not get over your head and have a digital edition in addition to, say, a print edition if you haven't really thought through all those details. And I think it's probably safer, if you really are just a print only edition, to simply make that case and not try to make your project into a digital project if you're really not prepared to do that, or at least if you might want to consider putting in an application for an early stage or planning stage project if you're serious about making your edition a digital edition. You want to put your best foot forward for that type of project. So what are things that make something ineligible? And when I say ineligible, I mean projects that we will not review. If it's these kind of projects, if we receive them at the deadline, we would declare them ineligible, and they would not be reviewed. They would be sent back. Projects that only do transcription digitization but don't actually provide that scholarly content. Projects that are translations into languages other than English, so from an original language into, say, French or German, those are not eligible. A a project that is, as I said, lacking new scholarly apparatus. So if it's simply a translation of an existing edition into English that only has the original apparatus from that edition, that is not enough. It needs to be sort of new work added to whatever that edition was. In addition to translation of a contemporary work. So we're thinking about those who might want to have their book translated into English, or perhaps a press that's interested in having support for getting their titles translated into English. Those are not appropriate projects for this program. Work that's without scholarly collaboration, as I mentioned, that there be two members of the team that have scholarly credentials and that can make a case for the need for collaboration between two scholars. And then there's a full list of things that would make a project ineligible or ineligible parts of projects if you go to page 26 and 27 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So you'll find what I just mentioned. This is the key to this, or the kind of the guide that you want to be using to prepare your application is this Notice of Funding Opportunity, which you'll find there at this place on the landing site. You see their scholarly editions and translations, Notice of Funding Opportunity for these 2 years. Of course, we do call it we call it Notice of Funding Opportunity. Sometimes we call it our guidelines. It means the same thing. And you should find and download that PDF. You'll also find on the same page a little further down below that are frequently asked questions, a lot of important and useful information there. You should look at that as well, read through that. It may answer questions that you'd otherwise have to call or email about. So let me give you an overview of the things that we'll be dealing with in the rest of this time. These are the parts of the application, the parts of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the guidelines. I'll be mainly talking about the things that are in red here. So sections C, D, and E, not so much A, B, and F. This is sort of the core of what you'll be preparing if you're the project director. Some other sections, so it can be a complicated set of guidelines to read until you break it down into these sections and see where sort of the core of what you need to do exists. So quickly here, we're actually not making major changes to the program this year compared to last year. But if you haven't applied before, it won't really matter because it's all new. Or if you didn't apply last year but are applying this year and you do come back, you'll want to look at what's new sections for the things that have changed. We anticipate potentially having a larger set of changes next year. And so we didn't make very many changes this year, except a couple of things we did make. For example, we've changed as I said, the deadline date for the drafts to September 24th. Which is up 1 week from last year, and there was changes to the language in the More Perfect Union initiative. You might want to look at that if you would be eligible for that. I won't go over these in detail here this year, but these are some of the things that changed from the prior year, which would have been 2019. Things like a new draft format, need for a statement of significance in the narrative, separate work plan. We are asking for a bibliography of 5 pages, no more. Some clarification about the editorial and samples of translation samples. Again, for sake of time and because this was covered last year and these are essentially not really new, I won't belabor that, but those are listed on the landing page. One of the things that was a change, and it's now the second year of it, is the fact that we have this cap of $100,000 per year per project, up to $300,000 if you ask for 3 years. It's important to remember that the cap is per year for we call More Perfect Union eligible projects. If you ask for more than $100,000 per year, you will not receive that. We will cut your budget or give you less, and you'll have to come back to us potentially to make changes. So I recommend that you keep your projects at $100,000. And if you give us, say, an odd number of months at like 18 months, it will be prorated based on that 100,000 cap. So if it's 18 months, it'll be 150,000 as opposed to 200,000. Projects that are eligible for More Perfect Union money are eligible to ask for an additional 150,000 in the matching only funds. So you'll have to get matched money to receive more than the 300,000 for 3 years. If you have more questions about what make you eligible for that initiative, you can email us. Otherwise, read over the new language that's in the it's in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, as we call it, guidelines. We do have a period of performance of between a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3 years you can request. And as we say, cost sharing or doing matching is not a requirement of this program. Word about eligibility. We have recently in the last few years changed it so that you must apply as an individual, as an institution, not as an individual, at an eligible institution. There's also been some language that's been added to this, although it's always tribes of Native American tribal governments have always been eligible. What we now say in the Notice of Funding Opportunity that in addition, NEH recognizes, especially encourages, projects that include Native American organizations and communities as lead applicants and project partners. Some words here about project directors. One of the things that, there's a listing of things on pages 4 and 5 of what we're looking for project directors. One thing I want to emphasize is this idea that the project director is a scholar and not an administrator at a university. And that they spend significant or continuous time and continuous time on the project. We're looking for someone who's really involved in the day-to-day, the week-to-week of the project, and I think it's that needs to be made. The case needs to be made for that in the application. We also want to receive only one application, sort of per project director, even though institutions can apply more than once to this program each year, for different projects. Only one project director applying for a project in this program per application year. And then not having overlapping projects and awards in this program where the work is overlapping. Section D is the application and submission information. You'll find here is the place where this is the section where you'll find how to download and where to get the application package, which is number 1. And then number 2 in the section is sort of the core of the content and the form of the application. So we give a great deal of detail in section, what is I here, the project narrative. That's the 12 pages that you'll be preparing on page, and you'll find the discussion starting on page 5, and then the research and related budgets on as following. And then there's discussion in section 3 of the various components of the application, and then 4 you'll find the attachments, which includes the project narrative, which is number 1, that has to be included there in the set of attachments, the 10 or so 10 attachments that we require. So the project narrative is discussed above, and then you have to create that document, convert it to a PDF, and attach it in that list. So the narrative, that core that I mentioned, the 12 pages, single-spaced, 1-inch margins, 11 point. This is the formatting that you need to have for that. And each of the sections of the narrative do have kind of recommendations for the length of each of those sections. That forms the core of your application. I would point out that even though 12 is a maximum number, you don't necessarily need to submit 12 pages. It's possible that you could describe your project in less, particular projects that are maybe only 1 or 2 years, projects that are early in planning stages may not require the 12 pages. So please do keep that in mind. It may be possible to cover it in less, but 12 pages is the maximum. The sections of the narrative are these 5: significance and impact, history, productivity, collaborators, methods and execution, and final product and dissemination. You'll find those sections beginning on page 5. And these roughly overlap or kind of relate to the review criteria to a great degree, which are listed here: significance, method, collaborators, work plan, and publication goals. And you can see the full review criteria on page 27. And so I would recommend that you sort of see these sections kind of in tandem. And in fact, on page 9, we show you how those narrative sections line up with the review criteria, if not in exactly the same order. They are represented there in the review criteria for each of the narrative sections. And I'll go over these in a bit in a minute here. So again, this is we're back to this listing of the contents that you'll find of your application. And the project narrative, this is what we call attachment 2 in that list. The first of the review criteria is the significance of the project, the intellectual merits of the proposed work, including value to humanities scholars, general audiences, or both. One of the things I'll emphasize something here, that is I think you need to make a case for humanities audience for your text, and also a case for there being the possibility of stimulating new research from your edition or translation. It's also worth making the case for how the material itself is significant. Don't assume that. So lesser known works of famous authors may still not be important, not worthy of an edition, unless you make the case for it. And important works of an obscure author may still be important and deserving of an edition or translation if you make a case for it, but you do have to do that work in the application. The methods and execution section, let me focus a little bit on the fact that we talk about clarity of expression here. And what that means is write an application that does not contain academic jargon whenever possible, and that you make a clear case for what your editorial policies are going to be, the rationale for what content is going to be added. And this section also talks, this criteria also talks about the accuracy of the translation, so that your sample that you attach should be free of errors. The third section is the collaborator section. This is important to talk in your application about the level of commitment by individual members and make it clear how much they're going to be working on the project in your brief work plan and then your later work plan, which is an attachment. I think one of the issues that comes up at times is when projects get reviewed is what exactly is the money buying when someone is on a budget for a certain amount of funding, whether it's 60,000 per year. Is that money being used to buy out time that the person does not already have, say, for research time? Make it clear that what the NEH funding is doing is making it possible to leverage time, either by getting course buyouts, or making it possible to spend more dedicated time on a project. That's worth discussing in your application if that's the case. There's also a line in there about international collaboration, and we talk about there needing to be equitable balance among those who are U.S. scholars and those who may be working overseas and who are non-U.S. citizens. Although this language doesn't fix a kind of a percentage of how many should be international and how many should be U.S., we're looking for what we consider to be a kind of equitable balance, and that these grants are not being used as a mere pass-through for what is really an international or non-U.S. based project. Work plan and productivity. There's a line here about the reasonableness of the budget. I think what we mean here is that does the project cost quite a lot, but doesn't seem to accomplish very much. Obviously, that's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but we do ask reviewers to consider that as a criteria, the reasonableness of the budget. And this can be something that as well that's judged for projects that have come in for us again for funding. How have they used their time in the past? Have they used it well? Have they produced what they say they're going to produce? And then fifth criteria is publication goals. Is there a clear explanation of the choice of the format, whether print or digital, and made it clear why perhaps another path wasn't chosen for your project? And again, don't promise to do digital if you don't have a clear plan at this moment for digital dissemination. Very many projects sort of fail to get funded because the plan for digital dissemination was pretty vague and clearly not worked out yet. And there's a lot to be done when it comes to providing not only for the technical expertise needed, but also to make sure that the project is going to be sustainable, both in terms of how it's funded after the project receives NIH support for its 3 years, and then how it's going to be continued and maintained. I think there's a lot that goes into that thinking, and I think it's important that to be a clear strategy in advance. So there are several types of forms and components to your application. And I'm trying to break it down a bit here just to understand the pieces that need to go into this. There are forms and attachments. The forms are the things that we provide for you to fill in, and then the attachments are the things that you create in something like Word and then create PDFs of. And so you'll find a list of all these components on page 18, both the forms which you download and then the attachments which you create. And they're both required types and conditional forms, depending on whether your project requires them or not. For example, an example of a conditional attachment is the attachment for productivity. Obviously, if you haven't received NIH funding before, you don't need to discuss productivity in the past because there isn't anything to measure it against. I would note here one of the things that frequently happens is that these forms are filled out perhaps not by one of the key members of the team, and mistakes are made in these forms. At least twice a year, I find mistakes in titles, misspelled words. These are things that obviously do not reflect well on projects when there's mistakes in such key information, because those titles go directly into our system, and you don't always catch them. Even if we do catch them, it's not really there. It's not really for us to do that, to change those things. And so I recommend that you carefully fill out those forms, particularly getting titles right, getting your project description right. Again, you'll find these attachments when you go to grants.gov. So if you go to that main page again, you'll see there grants.gov application package. When you click on that, it will take you to this page on grants.gov where these component forms can be found. The one confusing thing is that the attachments that you create actually get attached to a form, which is a little hard to wrap your head around initially. So you see there at the very bottom of the list on the left side, it says attachments. It's a form that you download, and then the form itself becomes a place where you put the individual pieces of the application together from existing files. And so there'll be slots to put your files, to put the pieces of your application together, including the narrative and the work plan and the other things that we require as attachments. So here are the list of those attachments that you need to create, and I'll go through them here briefly. Obviously, as I've mentioned, it's at that attachment 2, that 12-page narrative, that's sort of the core of your work and probably will take the most amount of time. Things like the work plan, the resumes, bibliographies are things that other people may be contributing to creating. And then, of course, the sample is an important attachment because it does show the work that you're going to do, give us some sense of how you're going to do it. Then there's these conditional attachments. Not every project will have to do those. Those of you who have done these applications before might remember that we used to have a kind of NEH generated budget form. Well, now we're using a kind of government-wide form, and that is actually a form that you will get from that other list of things. So it's not an attachment that we give you here, or that you create yourself, but it's actually a form, a government-wide form that gets used. So the first one is this key personnel, and the way that we want it created is alphabetical by last name, not as opposed to broken up into roles. It helps us to have this list of key personnel so that we can that we were able to kind of part of it is to help us not make sure we don't have any conflicts of interest, or that folks aren't working on multiple projects at the same time in the same grant when they're in the same year that they're applying. So this is a helpful thing for us, and also it gives folks an idea of the kind of the scope and the size of a team and what folks are doing. I would say err on the side of inclusiveness, including all those who are on the project, even perhaps people who are not going to have their resumes included, but it gives a sense of everyone involved, including advisors or people who are going to serve as consultants. Those can be all listed here and should be listed here. Two, as I mentioned, this is the second attachment. This is the narrative, that heart of the application, which again is 12 pages, so 12 single-space pages, where we give the suggested lists here, and session page counts for folks to use to sort of, and as a general rule of thumb of how long it takes to do those sections. And this, I won't go into a great discussion of this part of the application here for sake of time, but the discussion, you'll find that on pages 5 through 7 of the narrative is where that's laid out. Attachment 3 is a work plan, which if you've done these applications before might be new to you. This is where we actually ask you to break down the who, what, when, where of the project into 6-month periods in some kind of table with goals for each period and time commitments. The reason why we've done this partly is to make it easier to read, but also because folks had a difficult time sort of fitting this into their narrative, and many applicants would try to do this already in their applications, but it found it took up a lot of space, particularly if it's in a table. So I think it's kind of breaking this out into a separate attachment, we hope, is maybe making this a little easier and not taking up valuable space in the narrative itself. And then fourthly, we ask for resumes for each of the key personnel. So not necessarily everybody, but those who are going to be providing the scholarly content and who are kind of involved in the project on an everyday or week-to-week basis. It doesn't have to include every consultant, perhaps, or perhaps it doesn't have to include resumes for those on your board of advisors, but those who are kind of on the team and getting paid through the grant. These need to be 2 pages, which does require you do some trimming, probably for folks, because everyone has, most people will find themselves having longer than 2-page CVs or resumes if they've been in academia for a while. So you will have to be cut down a bit, kind of to the things that relate, experiences that relate most to the project, is a way of looking at how to cut these things down. The bibliography is attachment number 5, which is a maximum of 5 pages. This at minimum should talk about any previous translations or editions of the work, have those listed, but also provide evidence of the surrounding literature. I think bibliography doesn't necessarily have to take 5 pages, but I think it needs to cover the works kind of surrounding the text and make a case for that there exists a kind of literature around this text or this work, and so this does provide evidence that you understand the scholarly context of the work. If it's a particularly short list, if it's only a page bibliography, I think that often raises red flags for panelists, because they're concerned that maybe there's not much literature on this, or that there's a very limited audience. So I think ways that you can kind of creatively demonstrate that this work is part of a larger conversation in the academy, for scholars, for audiences, and that you try your best to make that bibliography reflect that. The attachment for samples, that we do not have a maximum limit for how for the samples. We do say that we limit each kind of sample to 5 pages. We obviously just want to see some evidence of the work that you plan to do. It can't necessarily, we don't want it to be overly burdensome. So we say 5 pages maximum of both an original sample from the text, which may be a facsimile of the original, say, book manuscript or scroll, and then or a transcription of that if it's not very readable, and then an example of how you're going to deal with it. So there'd be a second kind of sample. So many projects will have a minimum of 10 pages. But of course, if you're doing a translation from say one language into English, there may be a middle stage where there's a transcription from the original language, and so that might actually be a third thing that you could include. And then with the translations samples, I would emphasize that we need to have an example of the original text. So say if it's in Latin, that there be a sample to read the translation against. So there needs to be both an original text of some kind that is legible, and then a translation that can be used by someone who know the language on the panel and be able to read the two together. These should be as much as possible error-free. Oftentimes that can be a real damning criticism if there are obvious problems with the translation that you've made in your translation, and that the sample needs to also show what type of things are going to be done with the final version. So any kind of footnotes, any kind of emendations, or any kind of critical apparatus. Some examples of those is important, so that the reviewers can see examples of how you're going to deal with the text. There are other kinds of attachments. Other kind of appendices that you can attach depending on your need, such as if you have a text that's still under copyright, do you have a permission? I would recommend including a permission. If you already have a contract from a publisher for your work, it's useful you should try to include that as well, which shows that you do have that contract. In cases where someone is finishing a PhD, we'll have it in hand before the award start. This is a place you could put that kind of letter of a degree conferral. And then one thing we say is that we do not accept any kind of letters of evaluation or support. So please don't include testimonials or things from those who want to say a good word about the project. The purpose of this section is for things that are kind of make it clear that the project is capable of being done, not necessarily of its quality or those who support it. So we're talking about permissions and contracts here, not we're not. We would have to remove any kind of letters of support. The 8th attachment is the table of productivity. This is only for projects that have received NEH support before. So this is, and we talk here about the way we want to have this information presented, making it clear what was originally requested from it or requested for NEH to support, and then what was accomplished during the last grants. And we provide information here about the format of that. And then there are 2 more attachments, which I won't get into, which are conditionally required: your indirect cost agreement, which your grants office will know about, and also the explanation of any delinquent debt. Obviously, if you're asking for any indirect costs, you would have to have that indirect cost agreement included with your project. Or you could ask for, I think there's a rate you can use if you do not have a negotiated rate, or if you would prefer to use the lower rate and can use the lower rate, you would not have to provide that. As I mentioned before, the budget is not an attachment per se as it has been in the past, but this government-wide form. So if you don't have to create it from scratch, you have to fill it in and then save it to your application package. This is what's called the research and related budget form, which can be found there among the other items on grants.gov. Within that budget form, there's a place to attach. This is the one thing you do have to attach as some kind of PDF, is a budget justification. This is a place where you can just explain the why and the how and the what of your project. So say if someone is receiving funding and it's not clear what percentage of their time, or if you want to explain particular line items in there for the sake of review, you provide that justification, and there are more details of what you'd want to explain in the notice of funding opportunity. But I do recommend that I think it's even a required form, so or a required attachment. Do use that page to explain anything that's not evident in the form itself. Overall, I won't talk a lot about budgets here. As I said at the beginning, these largely, most budgets in this program consist of either time for salaried employees or on contract employees and travel. Those are the large bulk of the items that we support. There is, and it's often the case that the support we're able to provide doesn't necessarily pay for every phase of the project or every part of the project. It's often part of a larger, more expensive project, and some of which may be supported by the institution in other ways. But what you should make clear in your budget is what the NEH's role in funding, who's being supported, or what percentage of their time is being supported with NEH funds. The details of this are ultimately vetted. So if you've done anything in the budgets that's not allowable, those will get vetted by our Office of Grant Management at the NEH after you receive an award. So it's still possible to make some revisions to budgets if there's some things that are incorrect or not done correctly, and that can take place in kind of a post, kind of an offer phase of your award. There is a small role to be played in a budget for some expenses, such as software licenses, but we do say in the budget, in the discussion of what can be included, as a matter of programmatic policy, the purchase of equipment is not allowable in this program. And we also, I'd recommend that you check carefully that you've used the right indirect cost. This is percentage. There may be multiple costs. There may be multiple indirect cost rates, and you'll want to check with our budget office in advance which is the correct rate of review for your project if you have any questions. And if it comes down to a budget question, those are the kind of things that ought to be handled by a program officer in the Office of Grant Management, and a person to contact if you have questions is either Peter Scott, and his email is included here, or generally send your questions to the Grant Management email address, which is another way of it getting answered. And I would recommend either way, really. If you have further questions about this program, you can email me or my colleague who's also working with me in this program. And I put my email address here, jbuffetti@neh.gov, and then my colleague Madison Hendren, who's the program analyst for this program, and you can find her email address, mhendren@neh.gov, or just as easily, if you send questions to our general mailbox, additions@neh.gov, those questions will get directed to me or those who could answer your questions. We will be having a question and answer a webinar in a couple of weeks. So the date for that is September 9th. You'll find the details for that on the landing page of our program, December 9th at 3:30 Eastern Time. And we're going to have a live question and answer webinar, which I will also be posting that after it's held. So you may have, if you're unable to attend that, you'll still be able to go there and then watch that one after that one has been held. Please do attend that if you're able to. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or the rest of the program staff.